Hello and welcome back to the Jacob and Jacob podcast. It's been a while since we've filmed an episode and put one out, but it's good to be back. I'm your host, Jacob Rollbaum, joined as always by my co-host, Jacob Hare. And today we are very lucky to be joined by Jayson Stark, senior baseball writer at The Athletic. Jayson, thank you so much for being here today.
Guys, it's my pleasure. Glad to be with you.
So let's get right into the questions. We got to start with asking about the lockout. Tell our viewers a little bit about what that means and what we can expect as far as a new collective bargaining agreement between the players and the owners.
Well, it doesn't mean much right now. People really aren't interested, I find, in many labor details. But, the labor deal, the basic agreement ran out on December 1st. And so basically the league has two choices at that point. You can just keep talking, or it can impose a lockout, which is theoretically designed to force the sides to start talking so they don't miss any games. And that's where we are. We're going to be stuck in this for weeks, would be my guess, because there's no real impetus right now to get a deal done. People won't really start feeling the pressure on either side until they start getting close to spring training, realizing that there are games to be lost, money to be lost. That's what usually gets it going. The last labor deal, really the last two, have skewed very heavily in favor of the owners. So this is that deal where the players are trying to, I don't know if they're trying to win, but they're trying to get stuff back that they care about. The system's working really well for the owners. It's up to them. Like, they don't really see any need to change much of anything. And that's why we are where we are, is the players are pushing for changes that will favor them. The owners are basically saying, why would we do that? And again, this will go on for weeks. I don't see one big issue that anybody really wants to lose money over or lose games over. So that's my biggest hope. My biggest fear is these sides don't get along. And the more they go through week after week after week of not getting along and not making progress and not even agreeing on what they're talking about, then it could take on a life of its own. But right now, I think logically speaking, I see it ending before spring training. So let's cross our fingers.
Should the lockout not end before spring training? Sorry. How could that impact next season? And could we see a shortened season or possibly the season being pushed back?
Well, you certainly could. It's happened before. We've had 25 years, quarter century, without a work stoppage, without losing any game since the horrible baseball strike of 1994 and 95. And so the worst case scenario is what happened then happens now, that this thing begins to take on a life of its own. And they really can't agree on much of anything. They don't agree on much right now. That's a problem. The players feel pressure of some kind just to say, we got to win. And they don't feel like they need to give in. They feel pressure to show how tough and united they are. And, once you start to miss games and miss paychecks, to me, then the sides harden. Mm-hmm. That's where we don't want to go. And because once it really starts to chew away at what the things that everybody cares about most, if you've missed 10 games, if you missed 20 games, it's so easy to then miss 40, and once you miss 40, now you're really digging in because you got to make it worth your while. And this is what can happen. I don't see one issue that would remotely correspond to what has caused the big strikes, work stoppages in the past. But you never know. You really never know until we get farther down the road. And right now, they're barely even talking. So stay tuned.
So because of the lockout, a lot of the top free agents are still in the market, such as Freddie Freeman and Carlos Correa.
Happened before the lockout. The Texas Rangers made quite a few moves. They got Marcus Semien, they got Corey Seager. But then there's still a bunch of big name free agents that remain on the board, including Carlos Correa, Freddie Freeman, among others. How do you expect those sort of free agencies to play out after the lockout ends? How are their free agencies impacted by the lockout? And do you expect a flurry of moves when the lockout ends?
Yeah, that's a great question. Jacob, we talk about, all right, what could get the sides moving? At what point do they feel pressure to really get down to business? And I think one of those pressure points will come, I don't know, mid-January, late January, when you have these big star free agents who are thinking, hold on a second, I need time to sort out my life and know where I'm going to be and how much money I'm going to make. And I don't want to have to make that decision in a day or two. And they begin to apply pressure on the union to get this thing done. So there's a period where they can make decisions rationally. So what happens on the other side obviously depends on when this gets settled. If it gets settled with, say, 3 weeks to go in spring training, and you're already looking at a rushed spring training to get ready for the season, think how much every free agent who's not signed will feel the heat. They're all going to want to make a decision as soon as possible. We had this incredible flurry right before the lockout hit but a lot of it was confined to the starting pitching class and a few other big name players, but like the shortstop market barely moved. The outfield market barely moved, with a couple of exceptions. So as you said, there's still some big names out there, and I know that in the NBA, especially, free agency takes like half a day. LeBron becomes a free agent at midnight and he's signed by dinner. That's not usually how we do things in baseball. And so it could get really wild. But we saw how sometimes that works. It works for the benefit of the players. It did before the lockout. A bunch of star players and their agents saying, we're going to sign before December 1st. So let's get this done. And the same pressure points would apply on the other side if spring training is going to kick in like 2 days. You'd have star players, the Carlos Correas of the world, who have already obviously done some negotiating and know who's interested, saying to those teams, we're going to sign by Thursday. So get your offer in. If you're interested, let's do this. And so I think that's very likely what you'll be looking at. It's been wild so far. It'll be wild on the other side.
So, I mean, in previous years, there's been a few free agents who've stayed on the market past the start of the regular season. Do you believe that more free agents this season will be available at the start of the regular season than in past years?
It could be. There's still, if I'm doing the math right, and you can't say 6-year free agents, minor league free agents, there's still close to 200 players not signed. And just the sheer math tells you that if they all have to sign in a week, that's not going to happen.
Yeah.
Even if they all have to sign in 2 weeks, that's not going to happen. Some of these guys who are playing that game of musical chairs and don't have a chair, they're going to think, I'm not signing a minor league deal. I'm not signing a deal for $1 million with a bunch of incentives. I'm better than that. I'm worth more than that. And you have this massive disconnect where they just say, no, I'm not playing for that. And they hang out there into the season just to see what develops, whether somebody gets hurt and there's a need for him. And so that could totally happen. I think it's actually likely to happen. We just don't know who those players are who lose out in the musical chairs game.
Because I remember a few seasons ago, Dallas Keuchel was on the market past the start of the regular season, and it was the biggest deal in the world. But I feel like there could be 10 Dallas Keuchels on the market past the regular season this year.
Yeah, it could. It could be more than 10.
Yeah.
And sometimes that works. So like it kind of worked in his case. He wound up with the Braves. They were a good team. He rebuilt his market. Sometimes that works out, but there are a lot of times when it doesn't, especially for pitchers, because pitchers might think that they're simulating everything they do in the winter and spring training anyway. but there is, once the season starts, you can't simulate that.
Mhm.
And these guys are not game ready. We've seen it over and over and over again. So that to me would be a big worry if I were an unsigned starting pitcher.
Now let's kind of move past the lockout and talk about and stick with free agency. But after the lockout ends, who are some teams you expect to make noise in free agency?
Well, I think the one we talk about the most is the Yankees. They really haven't done much of anything, and they've got their needs. And, I think they're anticipating the kind of market that we just talked about
Mhm.
is this mad scramble, players just trying to find a team and a 1-year option or a 2-year option just to get into camp. And the Yankees are positioning themselves to be that team. So they're a team certainly to watch. The Dodgers are another team to watch. I think, I was out there in October when they were in the postseason, and the feeling then around that team was they were going to bring back Max Scherzer, and they were going to bring back Corey Seager, and they wound up doing neither of the above. And so they've got options to, at shortstop. Trey Turner still works there. He's on their payroll. He can play short, and they can slide Max Muncy to second or Gavin Lux to second, or they could do something dramatic. They're a team to watch on Freddie Freeman, for example. But that they'll be really interesting. And the pitching part of it, a lot depends on what happens with Trevor Bauer. Just hard to read what his suspension is going to be, whether or not they're obligated to pay him $40 million, whatever dollars. That's going to have a big impact on what they do. But Clayton Kershaw is not signed. Max Scherzer's gone. They've got big decisions to make on that staff. They had all this pitching depth when they started last season, and now they don't. And then in terms of, where I live, Philadelphia, that's another team with big ambitions. They have a tight window to win. They've got to make a lot of moves, I think, in a really short period of time. I think some of those moves will be trades. I do think they put some important pieces in place, or potential pieces, but then they have to execute, and they need to. There's a lot of pressure on that team to be good in 2022.
Now, we're both from Philadelphia, so obviously the Phillies have disappointed us quite a bit over the past decade. But I want to ask, what pieces do you think, obviously Bryce Harper, JT Realmuto, the pitching staff, Aaron Nola, Kyle Gibson, Zach Wheeler, of course, was incredible last season. Which pieces do you think the Phillies need to move past? Maybe a Rhys Hoskins, per se, and which pieces do you think that are on the free agent market or available in trades could they possibly look at to bring in?
When you say move past, you mean trade them?
Yeah, trade them or maybe not resign them. Like obviously, Andrew McCutchen is no longer going to be with the Phillies.
Right.
They announced that already, but
well, they've got no left fielder, they've got no center fielder. so you start with that.
The tall task.
I'm pretty sure that when the season comes, somebody will play left and somebody will play center all 162 games.
I hope so.
Okay.
It's a matter if they're good or not, though.
Yeah, they're interesting. Even going back a year ago, even before they hired Dave Dombrowski as president of baseball operations, I was asking people in baseball, is this a good job? Is running the Phillies right now as presently constituted, is it a good job or not a good job? And there's some division on that because obviously their system is not in good shape. But here's what one GM said to me, and this was really proven out. They've got ingredients to win that every team looks for that are the hardest ingredients to come by. That is middle of the order. Obviously the Bryce Harper part of that. And then top of the rotation. Like those were the strengths of their team in 2021, but there weren't the rest of the pieces just didn't nearly fit together. And Dave Dombrowski, that's been a strength of his. So I was surprised to some degree that he wasn't more aggressive in free agency before the lockout. But Dave has a really strong feel for what he wants to do and how he wants to do it. And the places where they were trying to maneuver were the places where not much got done. Bullpen is another one. They've got to fix the bullpen. I mean, they signed Corey Knebel. Corey Knebel could close if you can trust he's healthy, but they need, like, their 7th, 8th, and 9th inning guys are all gone. They got to replace that and get better. The left fielder, they obviously have strong interest in Kyle Schwarber. He has interest on multiple fronts. A lot could depend on, is there a universal DH or not, on whether he signs with the National League team, how big his market is among National League teams. Center field, I think they make a trade. I think a guy like Kevin Kiermaier makes sense. If you get an offensive left fielder, you can get a defense first center fielder. Ramon Laureano is another name to watch in Oakland. Now, he's suspended when the season begins, but they could cover it for a month if they need to, right? And then there's just all kinds of ways to go beyond that. It's hard to speculate. But here's something that one of their people told me toward the end of last season that I would keep in mind. Let me ask you guys what you think. He said, I could see us doing something unpopular, which I took that to mean, in order to get creative and in order to make a deal, you trade somebody that your fan base doesn't think you would trade. As I look at their team, I only see 3 places that could happen. One is Rhys Hoskins. One is Aaron Nola. The third is Alec Bohm. And I could see the makings of a deal with any of those guys right now. The question is, after last year, is their market value strong enough that you can do it and get what you need to get back? So I would say stay tuned. I would bet that Dave will trade somebody out of those 3 that you don't expect.
Now, I want to ask about Joe Girardi. I might have been the only person in Philadelphia who was mad when they fired Kapler. They call me crazy, but I thought he was fine.
You might have been.
I got a lot of hate from my co-host, but Girardi hasn't been what we hoped for. We hoped he would come in and, I mean, it's not his fault, but the bullpen situation would become better. So how long is his leash in Philadelphia? And could this be his final year if it's another non-postseason season for them?
Boy, it's a really hard question to answer. Just my sense of it is that he and Dave Dombrowski are very tight. That, they're in a way they're made for each other. They come from a very similar background. They both won the World Series elsewhere. They're both, they're both open to the way modern front offices and are run and the way modern managers run a game. But they both have roots that are more old school. I think they fit together. And so I don't think, as I sit here right now, that Joe Girardi would be on my list of managers who are in trouble. But a lot depends on what happens now over the next 9, 10, 11 months. If the president of baseball operations puts together a team that he thinks should win the East, should make the playoffs, should make a run in October, and then it all goes wrong, usually somebody pays for that. But that's not the team they have right now. And that's not the team they had last year. So there was no reason to move on from Joe Girardi in Dave's mind after last year. That can always change. The narrative over a course of a season determines who gets fired and who doesn't. So I don't think Joe is in a position where you can look at him and think he'll be the winningest manager in Phillies history. He's got to win at some point too. They've got to win. Their window to win with this nucleus is 2 years, 3 years tops. And so, like, the time is now. It's not a time to say, oh, well, we'll get him next year. I don't think.
Now, I want to shift to another NL East team that's been in a similar boat as the Phillies, where there's been some higher expectations in recent years, and they've really failed to come by them. The New York Mets. last season. They looked to be in great shape. They were in first place about midway through, and then a second half, they kind of just fell apart. This year, they signed Max Scherzer. They bring in Starling Marte. They lose Javier Baez, but still, the expectations are high again for the Mets. Do you think this is the year the Mets finally can put it together and get back to the postseason, or do you think the New York fans are in for another year of disappointment?
All right, here's my first question to you. Who's the manager going to be? Here is my second question to you. How many starts will Max Scherzer and Jacob Degrom make combined in 2022? All right, answer those questions and then we'll take it from there.
I mean, I think I would have to guess Showalter will be the manager there, or he's the heavy favorite right now if you're a betting man.
Yeah, I think that's a good bet. This is a job not for somebody who has never done it. This is for a job for a guy who has been there and done it in New York and has worked for tough owners and has worked his magic. I'm a big fan of Buck. I've worked with him at ESPN. I've worked with him at MLB Network. I know him really well. I think he deserves another opportunity. I think he's a really good fit for where they're at. Some things are out of his control, but if he has a chance to win, look at his track record. Every place he's ever been, they get dramatically better really quickly. And I think he knows this is his last chance. That'd be a really good hire. And I think they'll be a real threat. Max Scherzer and Jacob Degrom means you don't ever want to play them. You don't. They need to do more. They're going to go way over the threshold. That this is what they have to do to win, but they're a really dangerous team.
Yeah, as a Phillies fan, I'm kind of just anticipating checking the schedule a few days before we play the Mets and seeing DeGrom and Scherzer lined up to pitch games in the series against us. We can cross those ones off the list. But no, I think even as a Phillies fan, I think this Mets team, if those two are healthy, they'll be fun to watch, and they could be pretty good if they're able to stick it out the whole season.
Couldn't agree more. Absolutely. Tough division, man.
Yeah. So I want to shift to another subject, and it's a subject me and Earl like to ask our guests who are involved in the baseball world, and it's about the Hall of Fame ballot. So if you're comfortable, would you mind sharing your ballot from this past voting season?
You're talking about the ballot for the 2022 Hall?
Or for the 2021?
2021. Sure. I mean, I've written this. It's been published. You can find that out there. I haven't done my ballot yet for 2022. I've still got a couple of weeks. I usually take every day I've got. I voted for 9, and start with Bonds and Clemens. Voted for both of them. Happy to talk about why. Kurt Schilling, vote for him every year. I will continue to do that. Happy to talk about why. Scott Rowland, Todd Helton, voted for both of them. I think they're both on the track to get in. So that is 5. Okay. Billy Wagner. I think Billy Wagner, if you really look inside his numbers, has been clearly one of the most dominant closers ever, one of the most dominant relief pitchers ever. So I vote for him. That's 6. I voted for Omar Vizquel last year. Right now, I would say I probably will not vote for him this year. There's been a lot of disturbing stuff about Omar that I kind of want to let play out. If I remember right off the top of my head, the last 3 are Jeff Kent.
It's a good one.
Gary Sheffield. And I feel like I am missing somebody. All right, wait a second now.
It's hard to remember, like off the top of the head.
Look it up real quick. Hold on.
Yeah, for sure. But we appreciate you sharing it with us.
Okay, here we go. Schilling, Bonds, Clemens, Roland, Vizquel, Wagner, Helton, Sheffield, Kent. So that's 9. The guy I've gotten the most heat for not voting for is Andrew Jones. Happy to talk about him too. Up to you guys.
I mean, my co-host over here is a Barry Bonds fanatic. He loves
I
the
wouldn't say
man.
fanatic, but
He's a big Barry Bonds guy, to say the least. But
I'm a big Barry Bonds guy. That's fair.
I guess if we're gonna ask about a few of the guys that you voted for, I wanna hear your take on why you believe that Bonds belongs in the Hall of Fame.
Well, people say it all the time to those of us who have to vote. You guys need to keep all the cheaters out of the Hall of Fame. I always say, fine, give me a complete list of everybody who cheated, and I won't vote for any of them. But we don't have that list. Since we've had testing and punishments the last 15, 16 years, it's a lot easier to look at that group. So it's easy to look at Manny Ramirez and say, he got suspended 2 times. I'm not voting for him. It's easy to look at A-Rod and say, he got suspended for almost a full season. He got caught 2 times. I'm not voting for him. But before that, it's really difficult to play the guessing game of who did what. We've already proven we're not good at that game. There's no doubt, I think, in anybody's mind that we've already elected some player or players who use PEDs, because our conversations about who did what, it centers around the same 12 players every year, when we know that hundreds were doing something, taking something for all kinds of reasons. And so, we are not good at being the morality police. And so what I've decided to do for that period is, when you have players as clearly dominating, as clearly great as Bonds and Clemens, I'm going to vote for the best players of that era. And then, rather than have the Hall say, you guys figure it out, you handle it, I'd rather be saying to them, you figure it out. You decide what you want to do if Bonds and Clemens ever get elected. I don't think they will. I don't see any signs that they will. It's their last time and they're not making any headway. But to me, I don't know how you're going to explain in 100 years why the guy who hit more home runs than anybody who ever lived and won more MVPs than anybody who ever lived isn't in the Hall of Fame. If you want to put on the plaque, Barry Bonds hit more home runs than any player in history, but fine, be my guest. But I just would rather have the Hall figure out how to explain it than us.
Well, the thing that I always have to say in a Barry Bonds debate is, the Hall of Fame is supposed to tell the story of the sport of baseball. And can you tell the story without talking about Barry Bonds and Clemens? So I just think it's unfair to leave them out, because if you looked at the Hall of Fame, there's probably, as you said, at least hundreds of guys who were using something. It might not have been as serious as Barry Bonds, but it's definitely something. So you can't catch every cheater out there.
Jacob, that's perfect. That's a really good way to put it. I've explained it that way myself many times. Just again, think about in 100 years, trying to explain to your great grandchild, the guy who hit the most home runs ever, he's not in the Hall of Fame. The guy who won the most Cy Youngs ever, he's not in the Hall of Fame. The hitter who broke the all-time single season home run record and broke Roger Maris's record, he's not in the Hall of Fame. The guy got the most hits in history, Pete Rose, he's not in the Hall of Fame. Obviously, I was referring to Mark McGwire before, and on and on and on and on. What kind of Hall of Fame is that? The NFL doesn't care. They're going to they're going to tell the story of their sport and honor the greatest players. And you can apply all the asterisks in your head that you want. I think baseball needs to think that way. It's a history museum. What do museums do? They tell the story of a period of time, good and bad. That's what I feel like the Baseball Hall of Fame has to do. And you can tell that story however you want to tell it. This is tricky for me. I'm sure you guys know that I'm honored in the writer's wing of the Baseball Hall of Fame. And I went through an induction weekend with some of the greatest players who ever lived. Mariano Rivera was in my class, Edgar Martinez, Mike Messina, Lee Smith. It was quite a thing to be there, be part of that. and understand what it means to those players to get inducted into the Hall of Fame. But, these tides are shifting. And at some point, I wonder if they shift far enough that there will come a veterans committee that says, we need to honor players from that era. And then we can do it all one year if you want. And it can be PED weekend. But that's like right now, I don't see a scenario where any of them get in. But that doesn't mean that some of us aren't voting for them with that in mind.
Well, Jason, we want to thank you so much for coming on today. We know we're running out of time with you, but before we let you go, we have one final question. You've covered and reported and broken so many stories over the years, but is there one in particular that stands out to you?
A story I've written or a game I've covered or
Yep, it can be
something
anything.
along those lines.
It's hard. It's very general, but
yeah. All right. Well, let me try to describe it this way. I could name 50 stories, I'm sure, that have been really meaningful to me. But I think my favorite part of my job is when you're in a ballpark and the home team wins something. And here's why. You see something that people talk about for the rest of their lives. They experience something that they experience in no other part of their lives. How well do you guys remember the 2008 Phillies winning the World Series?
I remember it not so well, but I remember
Yeah.
I remember the day of the parade, and I remember waking up in the morning after and seeing my dad and how happy he was. But I don't remember too much from it. I remember more from the 2009 World Series.
You didn't go to the parade though, right? Neither of you?
No, I did not. I remember going to school that day, and there was like 4 kids in my class. I was devastated.
at least you learned your lesson for the Eagles.
Yes, for the Eagles parade.
Well, there you go. So yeah, so you do understand it from that perspective. And so I took my daughter to the parade, and it was quite a day. Now, like, I'm not a Phillies fan like she is, like everybody in my house is, like everybody lives around me is, because I write stories. I tell stories. The Phillies won the World Series that year, so I told that story. Even wrote a book. Took a lot of those stories and turned it into a book. But if the Rays had won, that would have been a great story. I'd have told that story. So I always have to make that clear. But I'm from Philadelphia. I'm surrounded by Philadelphians. I understood what that meant to all those people. A lot of them experienced something they had never experienced in their lives. And so that parade was crazy. The Eagles parade was unbelievable. Like 1 million people all assemble at the same place, bonded by this same powerful feeling, this emotion that they then experience together. Think about it. What else in your life allows that to happen? Is there anything else that people do in their lives quite like that? I'll wait. Tell me anything.
You're right. There's nothing.
Right? There's nothing. And so that covering that parade, covering the Phillies winning the World Series at home, as people I know and love just experience that together. That's special to me. I understand it. And, I'll tell you a story I've told quite a few times, but right we tried to drive to that parade and traffic wasn't moving at all on 95. So we got off, we just parked our car in the middle of nowhere, walked to the nearest subway and took the subway to South Philadelphia. So now to get back, we got to reverse our course and get back on the Broad Street subway. And so we get onto the most crowded Broad Street subway car ever. There's like 1,000 people on our car. And so we're just hanging on for dear life. And a guy who's across the subway car, he looks at me and he recognizes me and he makes eye contact. And now I can see he's going to try to wriggle his way through all these people between him and me to talk to me. So here he comes. And now he finally, okay. So he finally makes it over to where I'm hanging on there with my daughter. And he looks at me and he bursts into tears. And then he hugs me. And I don't know this person, that's what was going on there that day. He hugged me on the Broad Street subway. And then when he finally composed himself, he said to me, thank you. Thank you for telling our story, the story of this team, the way Philadelphians see it, not the way the rest of the world sees Philadelphia. And I thought, you know what? That's really cool.
Yeah.
And I'm just telling the stories, but those stories mean something to people. And I did grow up in Philadelphia. I haven't lived my whole life in Philadelphia, but most of it. And so I understand the meaning of that moment. And so I do feel like I told that story with that in mind. And really that conversation has stuck with me. It inspired me to say, there's a book in this team. That was Friday when the parade was. Monday, I started contacting publishers to say, hey, I got a book. And we made it happen. It was incredible. That Worth the Wait book came of it, but it came from the whole experience of covering that team, but especially the feeling of experiencing that moment with all those Philadelphians, and seeing what it meant to real people in their real lives. That's the meaning of sports summed up. That's my favorite thing about my job. And those are my favorite stories to tell, when you really connect with real people in a way that you understand this means something to them, not as fans, but as human beings. It's great.
Well, that's awesome. I don't think there's a story that can top that one out there for anyone that's a sports reporter. But Jayson, we just want to thank you so much for coming on and speaking with us. And we're so glad we finally made it work. Thank you again.
Me too, guys. All the best to both of you. Thanks for having me on.
Thank you.